Daniel Carter had never asked for much from life. At 38 years old, with calloused hands and tired eyes, he swept the same marble floors every evening that executives crossed without looking down. He pushed his cart through the gleaming corridors of Verion Global's downtown tower, a company worth $11 billion on its best trading day, a company whose name was printed on skyscrapers and spoken in congressional hearings. Daniel worked the night shift, 6 evenings a week, and when people asked what he did for a living, he always paused before answering, not from shame exactly, but from the quiet awareness that his answer changed the way people looked at him. He was a janitor. He cleaned up after people who would never learn his name, and for 3 years, that had been enough because at home, waiting for him in a 2-bedroom apartment 12 blocks east, was his daughter Emily, 9 years old, who still believed her father was the most important person in any room he walked into. Laura had died 22 months earlier, a brain aneurysm that gave them no warning and no chance to say anything that mattered. One morning she was making Emily's lunch, cutting the crust off a sandwich the way Emily liked. And by noon, she was gone. Daniel had held it together for the funeral, for the insurance calls, for the school enrollment forms, for all the mechanical business of grief that demanded a functioning adult. He had held it together because Emily needed him to, but in the months that followed, he had let things slip. The engineering courses he had been taking at night, the certification program he had put $50 a month towards since his mid-20s, the quiet ambition he had carried since he was a teenager, watching his father, Michael Carter, work circuit boards and schematics at the kitchen table, with the focused tenderness of a man who genuinely loved what he did. Daniel had once believed he would follow his father into the world of systems and structures, of logic and precision. Instead, he followed him into something else, entirely into a story he did not yet understand, was his to finish. At Verion Global, Daniel was part of a facilities team that most senior staff treated as furniture. The executives on the upper floors had a particular talent for looking through people rather than at them. And Daniel had developed, over 3 years of invisibility, the quiet habit of observation. He noticed things. He noticed which project managers stayed past 10 and left with hollow eyes. He noticed which assistants shredded documents before recycling, instead of after. He noticed the small tells of institutional tension, the way a certain executive would straighten his tie 3 times before a particular meeting. The way laughter on one floor could sound nothing like laughter on another. Daniel never acted on what he observed. It was not his world to intervene in. He cleaned the surfaces and left. And when he came home, he made sure Emily had done her homework and eaten something warm, and then he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and watched the city lights and thought about nothing in particular. Because thinking about particular things cost too much. Victoria Hale was 35, the youngest CEO in Verion Global's 40-year history, and she had arrived 2 years earlier, under circumstances that the financial press described as bold and that the company's board described in terms that were less charitable and private. She had come from outside the technology sector, brought in by a block of institutional investors who believed the company's legacy culture was suffocating its future. She was brilliant, structured, and entirely self-contained, a woman who had learned early that warmth was a currency that powerful men would spend against you, and who had therefore kept her warmth in reserve for so long that she sometimes forgot she still had any. Daniel had seen her exactly 3 times in 3 years. Once stepping out of an elevator, once crossing the lobby while security cleared a path, and once standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite while he mopped the hallway outside. Each time, she had not seen him. He had not expected her to, but on the 4th Thursday of October, everything that had been invisible between them was about to become very, very difficult to ignore. The board meeting on that Thursday was the most consequential in Verion Global's recent history, though Daniel learned this only in fragments, later. What he knew at the time was simple. He had been assigned to clean the 42nd floor conference room after the meeting cleared, which was unusual, since the 42nd floor was typically handled by a senior crew with separate clearance. The regular cleaner had called in sick. The supervisor had made a call. Daniel had been handed a keycard and a set of instructions. and he had ridden the elevator to the 42nd floor with his cart and his clipboard. Entirely unprepared for what the evening was about to cost him. The conference room was large enough to feel like a theater. A long mahogany table dominated the center, ringed by leather chairs that had been pushed back at odd angles, suggesting a meeting that had ended in haste or discomfort. The wall to Daniel's left was entirely glass, offering an unobstructed view of the city skyline, going amber and violet in the last of the evening light. He started at the far end, working methodically the way he always did, gathering water glasses and coffee cups, straightening chairs, wiping surfaces. The room still held the smell of people cologne, anxiety, the faint acid of strong coffee, and Daniel moved through it without thinking, the way his body knew how to clean without requiring his mind to be present. It was only when he reached the head of the table that he noticed the folder. It was a dark blue folder, thick, the kind with a metal clasp at the top, the kind that corporate document rooms stocked by the case. It sat at the center of the table's head position, as though someone had set it down intending to pick it up, and then walked out without it. Daniel reached for it with the intention of setting it on the credenza near the door, where lost items were typically left. His fingertips caught the edge at the wrong angle. The folder slipped, hit the table's lip, and landed open on the floor, and several pages fanned out across the marble in a wide, disorganized arc. He crouched to gather them. He was not trying to read them. His eyes moved across the top page the way eyes do when they land on text without permission, catching words before the brain can decide whether to register them. And the words he caught were enough. Account, pressing them back into the folder with the careful hands of a man who understood instinctively that he had touched something he should not have touched. He set the folder on the credenza. He turned back to his cart. And then, because his eyes were still moving the way they do when the mind has been disturbed, he saw the name on the page that had fallen face up at the edge of the table. Michael Carter. He stood very still. The city outside the window had gone dark while he wasn't watching, and the room was lit now only by the recessed ceiling panels, which gave everything a flat, artificial quality, as though the whole scene had been staged for an audience. He looked at the name again. He looked at the date beside it. He looked at the words beneath it. Technology theft. Internal investigation. Termination with cause. And he felt something in his chest contract with a force that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. His father's name, his father's ruin, printed in a document that had no reason to be here, unless the people who had been sitting in this room today were connected to something that had happened 15 years ago, something that had torn apart a family and sent a good man to his grave without ever clearing his name. Daniel set the folder down on the credenza with a care that was almost reverent. He straightened. He picked up his cart, and he walked to the door just as the sound of footsteps reached him from the corridor outside. He turned to face the wall, adjusting a picture frame that needed no adjusting, and the door opened behind him. A woman in a gray blazer entered without acknowledgement, crossed to the credenza, picked up the folder, and left. The whole exchange took perhaps 12 seconds. Daniel did not move until the footsteps faded. And then he stood alone in the conference room, with the city lights outside, and the ghost of his father's name still hanging in the air like something unfinished. He went home. He made Emily a late dinner. He sat with her while she finished a drawing she had been working on, a picture of the two of them at the beach, which they had not visited since before Laura died. Emily fell asleep at the kitchen table, and Daniel carried her to her bed the way he had when she was 4 and 5 and 6, marveling at how small she still was, how completely she trusted him. He stood at the door of her room for a long time after he laid her down. He told himself he would forget what he had seen. He told himself it had nothing to do with him. He told himself a great many things that night, alone in the kitchen with the coffee going cold, and not one of them was true enough to let him sleep. The security guard who appeared at the facility's locker room the following morning was not subtle about it. He was a large man in a uniform that was too tight at the shoulders, and he said Daniel's full name in the flat tone of someone who had been given instructions and intended to follow them. He said that Mr. Carter was requested on the 42nd floor. He did not say by whom. He did not say why. He waited while Daniel put his jacket on, and then he walked 2 steps behind him all the way to the executive elevator, and Daniel stood in that elevator with the security guard's reflection in the polished door, and thought about Emily's drawing on the kitchen table, the two of them at the beach, and whether she would finish it tonight. Victoria Hale's office occupied the northeast corner of the 42nd floor and was arranged, Daniel noticed, with a precision that suggested she had chosen every object in it, with the same criteria she applied to everything else: functional, deliberate, without sentiment. She was standing when he entered, not seated, which he understood immediately was a choice. She was taller than she appeared from a distance, and her expression was the kind that corporate training manuals described as neutral, but which Daniel recognized from years of watching people in professional settings as controlled anger looking for a justification to become something else. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I'd like to understand what happened in the conference room last night." He told her the truth, that the folder had slipped, that he had gathered the pages, that he had set the folder on the credenza and left. He told her this in a measured voice, without elaboration, because elaboration in a room like this felt like a weapon that could be turned around. She listened without expression. Then she turned to a screen on her desk and angled it toward him, and Daniel saw the camera footage himself crouching, gathering the pages, clearly visible in the kind of high-resolution detail that modern security cameras produced without effort. The timestamp read 7:42 in the evening. The footage showed him holding the pages for approximately 6 seconds before restacking them. 6 seconds, she said. "The pages were out of order," he said. "I was stacking them." "And what did you read in those 6 seconds?" He held her gaze. He had not planned what he was about to say, had not planned it in the locker room, or in the elevator, or in the long night before. It arrived from somewhere older than planning, from the part of him that had spent 15 years carrying something he had never been given permission to put down. "I read my father's name," he said. "Michael Carter." The room went very quiet. Victoria Hale had held her position against 2 attempted board coups, had negotiated restructuring agreements under conditions that had broken experienced executives, had faced shareholder meetings where the room had been stacked deliberately against her. She was not a woman who lost her composure. But something moved behind her eyes at the sound of that name. Not guilt, not recognition exactly, but the particular unsettlement of a person who has just discovered that a thread they thought was buried leads somewhere they did not expect. She held still for a moment that lasted several beats longer than professional composure required, and then she said, in a voice that had changed key by something unmeasurable but real, "Close the door." The assistant, who had been standing near the window, left without a word. The security guard did the same, and Daniel Carter, janitor, single father, the son of a man who had died without justice, sat down across from the youngest CEO in Virion Global's history, and began to speak. He told her everything he knew, which was not everything it never was, with family stories that had passed through grief and time, but it was the bones of it. Michael Carter had worked in Virion Global's systems engineering division for 11 years. He had been considered one of the best technical minds in the department, a man his colleagues respected and his supervisors trusted with sensitive projects. In the winter 15 years ago, he had been accused of stealing proprietary source code and passing it to a competing firm. The accusation had been swift, the investigation internal, and the conclusion predetermined in a way that Michael had never been able to prove, but that his family had felt with the certainty of people watching a verdict be read from a script. He had been terminated. He had been publicly named in a press release that the company's legal team had clearly crafted with the intention of preemptive liability management. He had spent 2 years trying to clear his name through channels that closed in front of him one by one. He had died of a heart attack at 61, a man who had stopped believing the world was fair, but had never stopped believing it should be. Daniel spoke without his voice breaking, which cost him something. Victoria listened without interrupting, which surprised him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she turned to her computer and began typing. She called up the internal archive, the document management system that held Virion Global's institutional memory, going back 3 decades, and she navigated to the folder corresponding to the incident year, to the investigation files, to the personnel records that should have contained a complete account of what had happened to Michael Carter. And what she found, in the slow, systematic way that a careful person processes information that contradicts a comfortable assumption, was that the record was wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. Dates that did not align. A signature on a key document that bore a timestamp inconsistent with the signer's travel records, which she cross-referenced with calendar archives. A witness statement that had been revised, the original version flagged as superseded. The revision filed by a legal department head who had retired 4 years later with a package that, now that she was looking at it, had been unusually generous. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Outside the window, the city was bright and ordinary, unaware of itself. The people who ran that investigation, she said, more to the screen than to Daniel. She scrolled through names. She stopped. She scrolled further. She stopped again. 3 names. 2 were current board members. 1 was the chairman. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "They're the same people who've been pushing for the no-confidence vote." And then her phone buzzed, and she looked at it, and something in her face went flat in the way faces go flat when the body understands a threat before the mind has finished processing it. She turned the screen so Daniel could see the message. It was addressed to her private corporate email, and it was unsigned. It read, "If you keep digging, you will lose this company the same way Michael Carter lost everything. You've been warned once." Daniel read the message. He read it again. He thought about his father's face in a photograph he kept in his wallet. A photograph taken at a company picnic the summer before everything collapsed, his father smiling at something off camera, with the uncomplicated happiness of a man who believed he was safe. He thought about Emily at the kitchen table, drawing the beach they hadn't visited. He thought about all the mornings he had ridden the elevator to other people's floors and cleaned up after lives that had nothing to do with his own. And then he thought about the folder on the floor, the pages fanning out, his father's name face up on the marble. 15 years was a long time to be a wrong that no one corrected. He looked at Victoria Hale, who was still looking at her phone, with the expression of someone recalibrating its speed. He said nothing. But he did not leave. Victoria needed someone she could trust. And she understood that trust in an environment like Virion Global was the rarest commodity available, rarer than capital or intelligence, because it could not be manufactured and could not be tested in advance. Everyone she worked with had an angle. Every ally she had cultivated in 2 years as CEO had interests that intersected with hers in some places and diverged in others, and she had learned to map those divergences the way a navigator charts rocks, necessary knowledge, always updated, never fully reliable. Daniel Carter had no angle. He was a man with nothing to gain who had been handed a reason to walk away and had not taken it. That, in Victoria Hale's world, was as close to trustworthy as anything got. She offered him a temporary position, unofficial, unannounced, structured as a facilities reassignment on paper that would allow him access to sections of the archive. She could not search herself without alerting the people she now had reason to watch. Daniel refused. Not defensively, not theatrically, he simply said that he had a daughter, that he had made her a promise the night of her mother's funeral, that he would not do anything that put them both at risk, and that whatever had happened to his father did not entitle the universe to take something more from his family. Victoria listened to this without argument. She sat with it for a moment, and then Daniel, who had not planned to say the next thing either, said that his father had spent 2 years trying to clear his name through the right channels, and the right channels had been owned by the people who ruined him, and that this was the only channel left, and that Emily would want to know someday that her grandfather had been a good man who had been wronged by people with power who thought they were untouchable. He said that he would do it. He said it once, without drama. And Victoria nodded in the way that people nod when they understand they are receiving something that should not be taken lightly. The investigation that followed was methodical in the way that Daniel's cleaning routes were methodical, systematic, unhurried, attentive to the corners that most people skipped. They worked in segments. Victoria used her executive access to pull financial records going back to the period surrounding the original accusation, cross-referencing transaction histories against the names that appeared in the revised investigation files. Daniel, working through the archive interface that he was granted temporary credentials for, searched the document management system for files that had been flagged as superseded, a category that administrators rarely audited, and found, buried in a version history 12 levels deep, an original witness statement that differed from the filed version in one significant sentence. The original said that Michael Carter had reported an anomaly in the financial reconciliation system to his direct supervisor 3 weeks before the accusation against him was made. The filed version did not contain that sentence. They found a retired quality assurance engineer named Roger Whitfield, who had worked in the engineering division during the period in question. He was 72 now, living in a suburb an hour's drive east, and when Victoria called him through an intermediary, he agreed to a meeting without the hesitation of a man who had been waiting to be asked. Meanwhile, the signs that they were being watched came in small, unmistakable increments. Daniel noticed a car parked outside his building 2 mornings in a row, a dark sedan with plates he had not seen in the neighborhood before. He came home one evening to find his apartment door unlocked, nothing taken, nothing obviously moved, but the particular quality of the air inside changed in the way that all spaces change after someone else has been in them. He told Victoria. She didn't dismiss it. She called a private security consultant who owed her a professional debt and arranged for his building to be monitored without Daniel's neighbors knowing why. The thing that changed Daniel's emotional landscape, not the facts but the feeling of the situation, happened on a Wednesday afternoon when Emily's school called. A man had approached Emily at the edge of the schoolyard after dismissal. He had not touched her. He had not threatened her. He had simply crouched down, according to the teacher who intervened, and said something to her that made her go quiet. And then he had walked away when the teacher approached. Emily told Daniel that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, that the man had asked her to tell her daddy to stop looking for things that didn't belong to him. She said it in a careful, confused voice. The voice of a child reporting something she had memorized, because it didn't make sense on its own. Daniel sat across from her and kept his face in the configuration of calm fatherhood, while everything behind it realigned into something with harder edges. He called Victoria at 11 that night and told her he was done. He said it without anger and without apology, which made it more real than either would have. Victoria listened to the whole thing without speaking. And then she said she understood. And she said she was sorry. And she meant both things. She said that her security team could have Emily in a protected transport protocol within the hour. That the school could be notified through a channel that would raise no questions. That Emily would not be approachable again without a response that the person approaching would not want. Daniel said that was not the point. The point was that his daughter was 9 years old, and someone had decided to use her as a message, and there was no version of this where that was acceptable to him regardless of what was at stake. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. And then she said something that Daniel had not expected from her. She said she had grown up in a house where her father worked for a company that made decisions for families, the way governments make decisions for countries from a distance, without full information, and with consequences that settled on people who had not been consulted. She said she had learned very young that power and proximity were not the same thing, and that the people furthest from the decision were almost always the ones most affected by it. She said she had taken the CEO role at Virion Global because she had believed she could change the way that calculus worked, and that in 2 years she had managed it in some rooms and failed at it in others. She said that she did not want to be a person who used other people's danger to accomplish something, even something worth accomplishing, and that if Daniel walked away tonight, she would not think less of him, and she would continue the investigation alone, and she would understand that some things were not worth the price. She said this in a voice that had none of the boardroom quality he had come to associate with her, measured, contained, projected for effect. It was a different voice, smaller, more honest, the voice of a person rather than a position. Daniel did not walk away. He arranged for Emily to stay with a neighbor he trusted, a retired teacher 3 doors down, who had known Emily since she was a toddler. He checked the security arrangements that Victoria's team had put in place. He told Emily that there were some people who were trying to cause trouble at the office, and that he needed to help fix it. The way you helped fix things, when you were the person who knew how. Emily, who was 9, and therefore smarter than most adults gave her credit for, looked at him steadily and said, "Is it about Grandpa Michael?" And the question nearly stopped his heart. He sat down. He asked her why she said that. She said she had found the photograph in his wallet once, the one from the company picnic, and she had asked Laura about it before Laura died, and Laura had told her a little, not everything, but enough to understand that something unfair had happened to Daniel's father, and that Daniel carried it the way people carry things that need to be set down. Emily said she hoped he could set it down soon. Then she hugged him and went to pack her overnight bag, because she was 9, and she trusted him, and that trust was the most important thing in his world. Roger Whitfield lived in a house with a vegetable garden in the front yard, and a dog that barked twice and then lost interest. He was a compact man with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent a career working with precision instruments, and he shook their hands at the door without the wariness that Daniel had half expected. He had been waiting for something like this. That was the impression he gave, not relief exactly, but a particular settled quality, like a weight that had been repositioned. He had been the lead quality assurance engineer on the project that Michael Carter had been working on when the accusation was made. He told them, at a kitchen table with coffee and a dog at his feet, that Michael had come to him 4 weeks before the investigation was announced, that Michael had found discrepancies in the financial processing module. He was assigned to audit transactions that should not have been possible given the system's architecture, and transactions that pointed toward an unauthorized external access that someone had attempted to disguise as internal. Michael had documented his findings and reported them up the chain. Roger had advised him to go directly to the CFO's office, bypassing the division head whose name, Daniel and Victoria now both recognized, appeared in the later investigation as the man who had first filed the accusation against Michael. Roger said that he had been interviewed during the investigation and had stated clearly that Michael had reported the anomaly before the accusation was made. He said his statement had been taken down, thanked, and then apparently revised in a direction he had never approved, because the version he was shown afterward no longer contained the sentence about the prior report. He said he had been moved to a different division 6 months later, given a raise, and never asked about it again. He said he had known what that meant and had been ashamed of what it meant about what he had chosen to do, which was nothing. He gave them a hard drive, a small external drive, older model, in a cloth pouch. He said it contained everything. The original documentation that Michael had compiled about the financial anomaly, the full version of Roger's witness statement, including the prior report, and the transaction records that Michael had flagged, which Roger had copied on the day of Michael's termination, because he had sensed that the originals would not survive the week, and he had wanted something to exist that could not be edited. He had kept it for 15 years. He had kept it because he had understood, on some level, that the day would eventually come when someone would sit across from him at this table and need to know the truth, and he had wanted to be able to give it to them. He had not expected to feel as old as he did when that day arrived. That evening, 36 hours after the Whitfield meeting, Victoria received formal notification that the board had scheduled an emergency session for the following morning. The agenda listed one item: a vote on a motion of no confidence in the current executive leadership, with a recommendation for immediate transition of authority. The notification included a statement, pre-signed by 7 of the 9 board members, citing a pattern of executive overreach and poor governance practices. It had been drafted before the meeting was scheduled. That much was obvious from the language, which had the quality of something written in advance of an event rather than in response to one. Victoria read it standing at her apartment window at 10 in the evening, with the city spread out below her in the indifferent arrangement of light and dark that cities take on when they are not performing for anyone. She called Daniel. She told him what the notification said. She told him the timing. She told him she needed 1 more day to prepare a formal presentation for the board, and that she did not intend to resign or to be silent, and that she understood completely if he chose not to be there. Daniel said he would be there. He said it the way he said most things, without excess, without performance, with the particular firmness of a man who had made a decision and was not going to spend more words on it than necessary. The board meeting convened at 9 in the morning in the same 42nd floor conference room, where Daniel had found the folder 11 days earlier. It had been reset since then, the chairs straightened, The surface is clean, and it looked, on its surface, exactly as it always had, which was the way that institutional spaces always looked, indifferent to the specific drama that was about to use them. 9 board members were present. 3 of them had been at Virion Global since before Victoria's appointment. 2 of those 3 had been at the company during the period of Michael Carter's accusation. The third was the chairman, Warren Ashby, who had joined the board the year after, and who had spent the intervening years cultivating the precise authority of a man who understood how to make consensus look inevitable. Ashby opened the session with the formality of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. He cited the no-confidence statement. He noted the pattern of concerns. He invited Victoria to make a statement before the vote was called, and Victoria began to speak, and as she spoke, Daniel entered. He had not been announced. He was not on the agenda. He walked through the side door carrying a laptop and a small external hard drive in a cloth pouch. And every person in the room turned to look at him, and several of them recognized him as the night shift janitor from facilities, which was a kind of recognition that assumed he had entered the wrong room. Daniel set the laptop on the table at the far end, and connected the hard drive, and opened the presentation he and Victoria had spent the previous night assembling, and he said, in a voice that was entirely steady, that he had some documents the board might want to review before casting any votes. What followed was not neat. Nothing of that kind ever is. Ashby objected, and 2 board members demanded Daniel's removal, and one called security, and through all of it, Victoria held the floor with the composed insistence of a person who had nothing left to protect herself from. She walked through the financial records. She walked through the transaction discrepancies. She walked through the original witness statements and the revised versions side by side. She explained the chain of custody for the hard drive, the identity of the source, the dates and provenance of every document. When the objections came, and they came in waves, loud, procedural, sometimes personal, she absorbed them and kept going. Because there was a record now, and the record was being witnessed, and that was the thing that none of the people who had spent 15 years maintaining this arrangement had been able to prevent. The audio file was the last item in the presentation. It was a recording Roger Whitfield's voice, 30 years younger, taken during a department review session in the year of the original investigation, predating Michael Carter's accusation by 18 days, in which Whitfield described, in technical language that was entirely clear to anyone who worked in financial systems, the anomaly that Michael had flagged, the report that Michael had filed, and the name of the division head who had received it. The division head's name was Harold Greer. Harold Greer had been on Virion Global's board of directors for 9 years. He was sitting 4 seats to Victoria's left. He did not speak while the audio played. He did not look up. The room was silent, in the way that rooms go silent when the air changes, and everyone present understands simultaneously that a particular version of events has just become unsustainable. The federal officers appeared at the conference room door before the session was formally adjourned. They had been coordinated the previous afternoon through a legal contact of Victoria's, one of the few people outside the investigation who had been briefed and asked to prepare the appropriate filings. There were 4 of them, and they were entirely professional, and the 3 board members who were most directly implicated, Greer among them, were asked to remain available for questioning. The session ended. People left, some quickly, some slowly. Daniel stood at the far end of the table and closed the laptop and unplugged the hard drive and put it back in the cloth pouch with the same care that Roger Whitfield had kept it in for 15 years. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of institutional consequence, which is slower than drama, but faster than justice usually is. The criminal investigation into the financial fraud was formally opened within 10 days of the board meeting. The revised documentation was entered as evidence in a case that, when fully assembled, described a scheme that had redirected approximately $240 million through a series of offshore holding structures over a period that predated even the original accusation against Michael Carter, a scheme that Michael had stumbled into without understanding its full scope, and that the people who ran it had dismantled him to protect. Harold Greer and 2 other board members resigned before formal charges were filed. Charges were filed anyway. The process would take months, possibly years, But the record had been corrected, and the correction was public. And public corrections, once made, are very difficult to fully unmake. The company's ethics board recommended a formal review of the original Michael Carter case, which was completed in 6 weeks, and resulted in an official finding that the accusation had been substantively unsupported and procedurally compromised. The finding included a statement of institutional regret in language that was careful and lawyerly but nonetheless real, and it was accompanied by a posthumous restoration of Michael Carter's professional record, his contributions to Virion Global's technical infrastructure formally acknowledged, his termination reclassified, his name removed from the list of employees who had left the company under adverse circumstances. Daniel found out about the formal finding on a Tuesday afternoon, in a brief message from Victoria that read, simply, "It's done. His name is clean." He was in the facility's break room when he read it. He sat for a while without moving, in a plastic chair at a table with a coffee ring on it and someone's forgotten newspaper folded to the crossword. He thought about his father at the kitchen table, working through schematics with that focused tenderness. He thought about the years of trying, the 2 years of appeals and letters and phone calls to people who had already decided. He thought about the heart attack, and the funeral, and the way grief accumulates differently when it is mixed with injustice, how it never quite settles into the clean weight of ordinary loss, but stays restless and unfinished. He thought about Emily's drawing. He thought about the beach. He sat in the plastic chair for perhaps 10 minutes. And then he straightened, and the thing he had been carrying, the particular weight that had no name but that his body had learned to accommodate the way a healed bone learns to accommodate, an old fracture shifted, and then eased, and he took a breath that felt different from the breaths before it. The ceremony was small, by institutional standards, a gathering of perhaps 50 people, in one of Virion Global's smaller conference spaces, arranged by the ethics board in consultation with Daniel. There were former colleagues of Michael Carter's who attended, men and women in their 60s and 70s, who had worked alongside him and had watched what happened to him and had carried, in various quantities, their own versions of that unfinished weight. There were current company employees who had known nothing about the story until the news of the investigation broke, and who had come out of something that combined professional obligation and genuine respect for what had been done to put it right. There was Roger Whitfield, who stood at the back of the room and did not speak publicly, but who shook Daniel's hand with both of his own afterward and held on for a moment longer than a handshake required, in the way of a person completing an obligation that has been pending for a very long time. Daniel sat in the front row with Emily on one side of him and Victoria on the other, and when the ethics board chair read the formal statement aloud, Virion Global acknowledges that Michael Carter's termination was the result of falsified evidence and institutional misconduct, and affirms that Mr. Carter's service to this company was characterized by integrity, skill, and professional dedication. Daniel looked straight ahead and let the words arrange themselves into something he could carry differently from now on. Emily held his hand. She had worn a dress she had chosen herself, a navy blue one with small yellow flowers. And she had asked Daniel that morning whether Grandpa Michael would have liked the ceremony. And Daniel had said yes, he would have liked it very much, and he would have especially liked meeting you. Emily had considered this for a moment, and then said she thought she was a little like him. Because she was also good at finding patterns in things that looked random, and Daniel had looked at his daughter in the morning light of their apartment and thought, not for the first time, about the ways that people persist in the people who come after them. Victoria had changed in the month since the board meeting. Though the change was not the kind that announced itself. She was still precise, still structured, still the person in any room who had done the most preparation and was least likely to be surprised by what happened. But there was something in her manner that had loosened, incrementally, in the way that things loosen when the effort of holding them rigid is no longer necessary. She trusted people more. Not naively, she was too careful for naive trust, but with a willingness to let the evidence accumulate before deciding, rather than treating the decision as already made. The executives who worked most closely with her had noticed it. Some of them attributed it to the crisis and its resolution. Some of them attributed it to a shift in the board's composition, which was undeniably true. A few of them, the more perceptive ones, attributed it to a night shift janitor who had walked into her office with his father's name and no agenda, and who had reminded her that trustworthiness existed outside the categories she had spent a career mapping. She found Daniel 3 days after the ceremony, in the afternoon, in the lobby, on his way to start a shift that he had continued without interruption through the investigation and the board meeting and the legal proceedings and the ceremony, because the floors still needed cleaning and Emily still needed the income. She asked him to walk with her, and they walked through the lobby and out into the building's courtyard, which had trees and a fountain and afternoon light at the particular angle that made everything look like something worth keeping. She told him that the ethics board's review had also covered compensation, and that there was a settlement available to the estate of Michael Carter that would require his signature as next of kin. She walked him through the figure, which was substantial, and watched his face do the careful arithmetic of a man who had been calculating on tight margins for so long that large numbers required a different cognitive register. She gave him the paperwork. She said there was no urgency on his end, that the lawyers would move at whatever pace suited him. Then she told him about the role. She said it carefully, because she had thought about how to say it for several days. And she understood that the way it was offered mattered as much as what was offered. The Technical Development Division was rebuilding its systems integrity function, the team responsible for exactly the kind of anomaly detection that Michael Carter had pioneered and that had been dismantled. She now understood, precisely because it worked. She said she had read Daniel's academic transcript from the engineering program he had attended before his wife's illness, had read the assessments and the project evaluations, and that the work described there was not the work of someone who had simply enrolled in a program. She said she thought he had something to contribute to the team that no one who had come up through a conventional technical career could contribute, which was the specific knowledge of what it cost when the integrity function failed and no one was watching. She said she understood entirely if he wanted to stay where he was, or find something else, or take 6 months to think about it. And she said she meant that. Daniel said he needed time to think. She said, of course. They stood in the courtyard for a moment, the fountain making its unremarkable noise, the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does. Emily had been waiting in the lobby with a book, which she had read 3/4 of by the time Daniel returned. And when he came through the glass doors, she looked up at him and said, "Dad, do you like Victoria?" The question arrived with the particular directness of a 9-year-old who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided that the most efficient approach was to simply ask it, and Daniel stopped mid-step and stared at his daughter with an expression that was trying simultaneously to be several different things. He started to say something measured and adult, something that balanced honesty with appropriate context, and then he saw Victoria over Emily's shoulder. She had followed him back through the glass door, intending to say one more thing she had forgotten, and the expression on her face was a thing he had not seen before on a person who had spent 2 years making sure her face gave nothing away without permission. It was not embarrassment exactly, and it was not the controlled blankness of professional composure. It was something between those things, a flicker of something real and slightly unguarded, there and then contained, but not quickly enough to be entirely invisible. Daniel looked at his daughter. He laughed, not the polite laughter of social obligation, but the real kind. The kind that comes from a place in the body that has been under pressure for too long, releasing upward. He laughed and shook his head, and Emily grinned, because she knew she had done something, even if she was not entirely sure what. Victoria stood at the glass door with a file folder in her hands and said nothing, and the corner of her mouth moved in a direction that she did not attempt to correct. They walked out together through Virion Global's main courtyard, Daniel and Emily and Victoria, into an afternoon that had gone gold with the particular autumn quality of late light that makes cities look like they haven't been constructed specifically to receive it. Emily walked between them, still reading the last few pages of her book, trusting the adults to manage the sidewalk. Daniel had not yet answered her question. He suspected she already knew. Victoria walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the middle distance in the way of a person who is thinking about something and has decided to let it be thought about slowly. The three of them moved through the courtyard in the late light, and the fountain was still running, and the trees were still losing leaves in the quiet way that trees lose them, not dramatically, but persistently, as though the act of letting go was simply what came next, what was always going to come next, given enough time and enough change in the air. Somewhere behind them, on the 42nd floor, the conference room was empty, and the chairs were straight, and the table was clean. On the floor where Daniel had spent 3 years pushing his cart, the marble was polished and reflecting. The folder was long gone, filed or shredded or archived in some office that would never know what it had set in motion. But what it had set in motion was here, walking in the afternoon light, a father who had set something down, a daughter who had never doubted him, and a woman who was learning, for perhaps the first time since she was very young, that the most valuable thing in any room was not control or intelligence or preparation, but the willingness to trust someone who had earned it, and to let that trust become the thing you built from, going forward, into whatever came next.